We are in section 11.1, learning about square roots today. Square roots, perfect squares, solving equations. There's quite a few examples in the lesson, so we will just go ahead and just start moving through those. First thing you need to know are these definitions. Please write them down. All right, so a square root of a number is a number that can be multiplied by itself to give another number, okay? So it's not just a factor, all right? Numbers have lots of different factors, but a square root is going to be a factor of that number that can be multiplied by itself to get to the end number. So the square root of 64, what's a number that can be multiplied by itself? 8. Okay, so square root of 64 is 8. Is that the only factor? No. What's another factor of 64? 2, 4. Okay, there's other factors, but there's only one that can be multiplied by itself. That's why that one's the square root. All right, what about square root of 81? 9. What about square root of 36? What's a number? Yeah, very good. 6, because 6 times 6 is 36. And then what about square root of 4? 2. Okay, any questions on square roots? How we get them? All right, so now let's look at the flip side. And let's look at what we call perfect squares. A perfect square is a number. It's the product, okay? So when two factors are multiplied together by each other, so 2 times 2 equals 4. This number is what we call a perfect square because two numbers can be multiplied by itself, or one number can be multiplied by itself to equal that number, okay? To equal that number. So since 2 times 2 is 4, 4 is a perfect square. Since 3 times 3 is 9, 9 is a perfect square. 16 is a perfect square. What would be the next perfect square? After 16, what's 5 times 5? 25. So 25 is a perfect square because 5 times 5 is 25. Anybody think of some other perfect squares? Peyton?
10 times 10 is 100.
So 100 is a perfect square. Okay? 10 is the square root. 100 is the perfect square. What's another one? Chris? So 36 is a perfect square and 6 is its square root. What's another one? There's a bunch more. Caleb, can you think of one? 9. Okay, well 9's up there. Jackson, can you think of another one?
25.
Well, that one's up there. All right. Mason?
81.
81, because 9 times 9 is 81. You with me, Jordan? You following? You writing down your notes? Okay. All right, so perfect squares. Perfect squares, that's the product, okay, when a number is multiplied by itself. Then the last definition that you need to know is the definition of a radical sign. The radical sign is the square root symbol. And it is it positive or negative? What does the definition say? It is positive unless you see the negative in front of it. So in this case, anytime you see the radical sign, your answer is either going to be positive or negative. It will not be both. If there's no radical sign, then technically a number has 2 square roots, and we'll talk about that more in a second. All right, so what does this look like in examples? Okay, well, let's look at example 1. In the first part of your homework tonight, it's going to say to find the 2 square roots of the number. Well, what it means by that is that any number is going to have 2 square roots, a positive value and a negative value. So let's look at 81. Well, we know that the square root of 81 is what? 9. Okay, because 9 times 9 is 81. This part you don't have to show in your homework. I'm just showing you so you can kind of see the why behind it. Well, what about negative 9 times negative 9?
Negative 81.
It is positive 81 because how many negatives did I just multiply? Two negatives, even number, positive answer. So since negative 9 still produces a positive 81, my square roots are going to be positive and negative 9. Again, you don't have to show this work on your homework, but that's the why behind it. That's why I can have a negative square root as well. Okay, so positive and negative 9 are the two square roots of the number, and this is how I want you to write your answers. I don't want you to write 9 comma negative 9. I want you to write it with a positive negative symbol. All right, I want you to try the second one. What are the two square roots of 49?
Positive 7 and negative 7.
Okay, but how do we say it? We say positive and negative 7. We put the positive and negative symbol out in front of the 7. Did you get that? Did you get that?
Yes.
Okay, so two square roots of the number, we give it a positive and a negative value.
What if it's just a positive?
Then it's just going to be 7 if it's just one or the other. And that's what you're going to see in example 2. Because what did we say about the radical sign? The radical sign is positive. It is positive. Okay, yes, it represents the square root, but its sign is positive. It is not going to be a positive and negative answer. Unless you see the negative in front, then it's going to be a negative answer, but it's going to be one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
So if you see a radical in the original problem, your answer will either be positive or negative. It won't be both. All right, so with that being said, I want you to go ahead and find the square roots of all of these numbers. If there's a negative out in front, you know that your answer is negative. If there's no negative, then you know your answer is positive. All right, square root of 36 is, 6. Just 6, not positive, negative, because the radical is positive, so it's not going to be both. All right, what about square root of 16? 4. What about negative square root of 16? Negative 4. What about square root of 0? 0. What about negative square root of 625?
25.
Negative 25. Who got them all? Did you get them all? Okay, any questions? Any questions on taking the square root? Okay, are y'all getting confused about whether your answer is positive, negative, any of that? Any questions? Okay. All right, in example 3, I want you to read the example with me. We are on page 533. It says, how fast does a pole vaulter need to be running in order to clear a height of 16 feet? Okay, you know what a pole vaulter is, right?
Yeah.
All right, so how fast do they need to be running to clear a height of 16 feet? Now, little disclaimer, this is not going to be a realistic answer, but that's okay. We're just going to go with it. They give us the formula S equals 8 times the square root of H. So is that something you have to memorize? No. That's what the problem gives us. And they told us how high are they trying to go? How high? 16 feet. So S equals 8 times the square root of 16. I just plug in 16 for H because that's the height that they're trying to clear. So now I need to solve this. What is 8 times the square root of 16? Well, what do I need to do first? Find the square root of 16. What is the square root of 16?
4.
So S equals 8 times 4. And what's 8 times 4?
32.
Feet per second. Okay, obviously it is impossible to run 32 feet per second. But for example's sake, we're just learning how to plug in numbers into the formula and solve. Substitution and solve. In example 4, we're evaluating expressions. So what we're doing now is we're plugging in the value for the variable and then we're going to evaluate it. All right, so I can't do 29 plus z, but I can substitute in a value for z. What's my value for z?
7.
So the square root of 29 plus 7. Does everybody see where I got 7 from? And now I'm going to simplify everything under the radical. Okay, so what's 29 plus 7? 36. So what is the square root of 36?
6.
Is it positive negative 6?
No.
Is it both? Why? Because the radical is positive, guys. The radical is already in there. It's positive, so my answer is just 6. Okay? All right, now the next one is a little trickier. I want you to at least try the substitutions. Try to solve it if you can. There's one part that might trip you up, but we'll see who can get it. All right, so we have the square root of 7 squared plus negative 2 squared plus 11. Well, let me ask you this before we go any farther. An exponent means what? What do I do to the number when it's raised to a power?
Number times itself.
That number times itself, right? So what is negative 2 times negative 2?
4.
Positive 4. Because it's 2 negatives, even number, that would be a positive answer. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So if you raise a negative number to an even exponent, it's going to be a positive answer. So now I have the square root of 49 plus 4 plus 11, which is the square root of 64, which is going to be 8.
I win.
Anybody get it right? Did anybody get it?
Yes, I done did it.
Okay, if you didn't get that far, do you see what we're doing? Do you understand? I want to see your heads nodding or your hands being raised with questions. All right, one more example. One more example. In example 5, we're solving equations. I want to do just a quick review of solving equations just to kind of get your minds working in the right direction. All right, so if I had 3x equals 24, how would I solve for x?
You divided by 3.
I divide because I need to do the opposite operation. 3x is being multiplied, correct? 3 times x. There's no sign in between those terms, so I know it's multiplication. Divide both sides by 3, and x equals 8. Right?
Yes.
So I have to do the opposite operation to solve for the variable. Now, in example 5, I have what attached to my variable? What is this thing attached to my variable? What is that called? It's called an exponent. So here's the question. How do I get rid of an exponent? What do I need to do? Well, in order to get rid of any term that is raised to the second power, okay, that's raised to an exponent, I have to take the square root. If it's squared, the opposite operation is to take the square root. So if I want to get x squared by itself, I must take the square root to get x. But what's my number one rule for solving equations? Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. Okay, so whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. Square root of 25 now, okay, there was no radical in my original problem. Anytime I solve these equations, my answer will be positive and negative. Why? Because what is negative 5 times negative 5? Positive 25. It still works out, so that's why I can have a positive and a negative answer. All right, so let's brainstorm this second problem for a second. H squared plus 5 equals 54. All right, well, if I'm solving this equation just like I solve any other equation, what do you think you do first?
Solve for it.
You need to subtract 5 from both sides first, because my rule for solving equations is move everything that's not connected to the variable first. Subtract 5 from both sides. H squared equals 49. And then, how do I get h by itself? How do I get rid of my square? I need to take the square root of both sides. Square root of h squared, square root of 49. H equals 7. Oh wait, did I forget something? my positive and my negative. It's positive and negative 7 because negative 7 times negative 7 is still positive 49. It still works out. All right? And that's how I solve equations involving taking the square root. That's everything you need to know for 11.1.